You've heard their name in stories, Sunday school classes, and from the pulpit. And now it's time to vote to see who is Poplar Springs' favorite Bible character. All right, hey everybody. Um, got some fun stuff planned for you. I figured the next couple of weeks we could take some time and just kind of see what everybody's favorite Bible character was. And so I've got a tournament bracket set up with 64 characters, and we're going to go through them throughout the weeks. You'll have a round on Sundays and Wednesdays and a video to watch, kind of talking about each matchup that you have. And there'll be a link in the description area and floating around Facebook that you can click, and you can go in there and you can vote up to the day before around lunchtime. And then whoever wins moves on to the next one. And we'll see where this goes. So this is a Sunday school lesson for my Sunday school class, but any of you are welcome to dive in who happen to be watching the video, since we are stuck in some type of quarantine still. But I hope you guys enjoy this and kind of take the time to take on the challenge to go and look at some of these characters in the Bible that you may not be familiar with before you go in and vote, because we may have an upset. You never know. Just a couple things for you before I dive in. One, Jesus and God are not in the tournament bracket, because you figured, Father is the Son, Son is God. Holy Spirit's not in there either. None of the three. So you have to worry about voting on the 3 and 1. We figured they would have won if they were in there anyways. So these are all other characters besides them. I'll try to go and try to tell you where you can find them in the Bible. And like I said, take the time to read up on it. This particular round 1 in tournament bracket A, is going to be closed or will be open from Sunday to Tuesday by lunchtime, and then I'll close that poll and set up the next one for you, and then Wednesday the next video comes out, and then by Friday at lunch that poll will go through. So we'll go Sunday through Tuesday, Wednesday through Friday, and then we'll just see where we end up. I figured by the end of the month we've gone through 64 characters, talked about them a little bit, and you guys have voted to see who was going to win it. So, with all that being said, let's dive into the first one. Paul versus Barak. All right, here we go. So, the number 1 seed taking the in the whole tournament, and I didn't put these in the I just found a bracket I went with, and I kind of agree with some of them, so we put it in there. So, the number 1 seed we're going to talk about is Paul. So, the Apostle Paul was Saul. Credit for knowing or for starting most of the churches in Asia Minor and Europe. A lot of his stuff you'll find in the book of Acts, and so, the history of the church. So take time to go read up on him. I'm sure most of you know about Paul, but, dig a little bit deeper. 13 of the 27 New Testament books are attributed to him in some possible way, especially through the letters. So he has a 98% chance of winning his round. I have statistics too that I found when I was doing all this, so just kind of go for what you want to. But we'll see who he's up against. So he's up against Barak. Now, Barak, unfortunately, is the last seed in the entire thing, but someone had to be last. I didn't really know this character. I've heard of him slightly, but I went and dug a little bit. You can find him in the book of Judges, chapters 4 and 5, and he's real big with Deborah. So if you know anything about Deborah, you'll realize where he is. And he's basically the general who Deborah went with into battle, and he was up against an army of all chariots and was kind of scared about what was going to happen. But she said, don't worry about it. God's already told you how you're going to win this thing. Let's go. But just keep in mind, a woman is going to be credited with killing the king, the king who was against them. And eventually it does happen that way. Both these characters kind of have their flaws. Obviously, Paul had a whole bunch of flaws at the beginning. He was Saul, and you can read about that coming into it. Barak was a little timid about wanting to dive in, and it wanted Deborah to come with him. Didn't really trust what God had planned for him, but Deborah went, and it still worked out for everybody. So take the time to kind of look in and see what you think about those two. Jacob versus Timothy. Here we go. All right, so Jacob versus Timothy. This one is tough. Okay, so this is the number 8 seed versus the number 9 seed. Okay, so Jacob, who is in the 8th seed, and he's super important. We know, we find in the book of Genesis, he was one of the sons of Isaac. But Jacob eventually becomes Israel. And we know, obviously, that's important because of the whole Hebrew lineage that we have in there. But most of you know that Jacob was the brother of Esau, and eventually he steals his brother's birthright and he steals his blessing. So two things he steals from him. Now, depending on if you think it's mom's fault for it, if Esau wasn't quite ready to be the leader, think about what God promised Rebecca before the kids were born, and something you can think about when you go to read on it. But go check it out. He's in the book of Genesis, and like I said, super important guy. He eventually wrestles with an angel. If any of y'all know how that works out, but I think you'd enjoy reading by him and kind of see where does he belong in this bracket. I think he's a good spot at 8 because coming in at the 9th spot is Timothy. And for those of you young folks know about Timothy, Timothy was one of Paul's right-hand man, kind of walking around with him doing all of the missionary work that they were doing. But he worked with Paul in the early Christian church, one of the early Christian evangelists, and 2 of the letters that Paul wrote were addressed to Timothy directly. So, go and read up on those 2 letters and kind of pick between, Jacob and Timothy, which one you think deserves to go to the next round. Right now, statistically, they have Jacob winning this round at 62%. But y'all could change that. That's still a close margin there. You could switch it over and send Timothy in. So you vote and see which one you think it's going to be. Job versus Hosea. All right, next. Here we go. This is probably the toughest guy in the entire bracket, in my opinion. Okay, so coming in at the this is the 5th seed. The 5th seed. This is Job. So we all know what happens with Job. You can go look at the book of Job in the Old Testament and see what you think of him. But Job goes through a lot. And God let Satan just kind of rip everything away from Job. And, Job, being the tough guy that he is, never turns on God. Even when his friends start flipping on him, telling him, it's his fault that he's going through this. Job knows it's God's will, and he sticks with it. Eventually, God comes and doesn't really answer questions, but helps Job to understand it's my will. It's what it needs to be. And Job just goes with it. And Job, just like I said, is a tough guy. I see him going maybe deep in this tournament bracket if you're a fan of Job and seeing how it is to be a tough follower of Christ or of God. But Hosea comes in at 12 though. Okay, so the 12th seed that's up against Job is Hosea. Okay, so you can find he's one of the prophets from the Old Testament, the book of Hosea. All right, they call him the prophet of doom. Okay, that's like a cool name to have if you're in a tournament bracket. Okay, but a lot of his book is also about restoration and being able to come back from what the Israelites are about to go through. But, read up on Hosea. See what you think about him. And then kind of make a decision. Who do you think deserves to go to the next round? Job, the tough guy, or the prophet of doom, Hosea? That'd be an interesting matchup. See how that works out. Joshua versus Esau. We are at the 4 seed. The 4 seed. So coming in the 4 seed is Joshua. Joshua is a pretty tough dude himself. Joshua... You can find him in the book of Joshua. He is the right-hand man of Moses. Eventually, he was a spy before, really helping out Moses for it. But he was one of the spies that went in to see what the Promised Land was all about. Eventually, he would take the place of leading the people after Moses left. So that's some big shoes to fill for a guy to have to do. We've talked about Joshua before. And eventually, he'd lead the people to the Promised Land. So, go read up on Joshua. See what you think about that, and see how he stacks up against the next one, which is a guy who had it kind of rough, depending on where you look at it, and it's Esau coming in at the 13 seed against Joshua. And you know how bad it worked out for Esau. I mean, Esau was the hunter-gatherer of the 2 brothers. His twin brother was Jacob, who we've already talked about. And Esau eventually, he traded his birthright for some soup or some stew. Yeah, go look that up. That's interesting. He was so hungry, he was willing to give up his birthright for that. But eventually, he goes out to go hunting, and mom convinces his twin brother to dress up like him and puts the fur on and, steals the blessing he's supposed to have. And unfortunately, he comes back and realizes what has happened, asks his dad for a blessing, and dad's told him, I've already given it to your brother. He said, best thing I can tell you is you'll live by the sword, and your brother is going to rule over you. So that's kind of an interesting story there. And if you kind of read up on the history of him, there's some other things that go on with it. But, I got a feeling that next round is going to get stolen from him too, because right now they got Joshua at 95% at winning that round. So if you decide that you think, if you like to shake it up a bit and just vote for someone different, or if you agree with the way the percentages is, you decide Joshua or Esau. Solomon versus Ishmael. All right, so we got 4 more matches for this round. The next one coming up is the number 6 seed, probably the smartest guy in the entire tournament, and that is Solomon. Son of David, super wise king. He did a lot of foolish things, But when it comes to leading the country, he was very wise. He gave him a lot of wealth, really prospered the country, and it's credit for having the for building the first temple. So think about that. You know, the temple was really big for the Jewish people, and he was the first one to build a temple for God. So go through. You can look up Solomon. He has a couple of books attributed to him. Looks like he's the son of David. Eventually took up after him. It had some tough times when the kids eventually came around that he had to deal with. But go look it up, see what you think about Solomon. And then this character kind of came out of nowhere. I didn't expect it to be on the list here, but coming in at the 11th seed is Ishmael. Now, if you don't know who Ishmael is, that is Abraham's first son that he had with Hagar. So that's not Isaac that we're talking about. It's the first son. And if you remember anything about them, this is around Genesis 16 is what I have written down. His story comes into play eventually after Abraham has Isaac. Hagar is eventually going to be told she had to leave, but Hagar worried about her and her son. God said, "I am going to make or bless your son and have a nation after him." And so kind of go look at that. I think Ishmael probably has a little rough going against Solomon in the first round, but his story is pretty interesting. And if you see how that works out with Abraham and how some of the other cultures of the world work out, you may think that Ishmael's pretty important. So see what you think about those two. Peter versus Boaz. All right, next, coming in at the 3 seed. Okay, this is probably like the coolest name to have if you're in a bracket. Okay, so we got Peter, better known as The Rock. Now, if you're a wrestling fan, you know who I'm talking about. If you're not a wrestling fan and you know who Dwayne Johnson is, okay, you still know what I'm talking about. But if you don't know anything else, just pretend I never said any of that. But The Rock, which is a really cool name to have. So he is one apostle and disciple, super important guy. You can find him in the Gospels. You can find him in the book of Acts, which is the history book. So it has a lot of stuff of him helping build a church. And he is credited being the first leader of the early church. So we know what downfalls that Peter had after there was the crucifixion and everything. But he had his chance to make up for it and all the work that he did with Jesus and what he would do for the church afterwards. So look into that and see how he compares to the number 14 seed, which is Boaz. Boaz, comes in at 14 seed from the book of Ruth. So go take a look at that. And if you know how the book of Ruth works out and how it's Naomi and Ruth are kind of walking around and Ruth wouldn't leave her. But he's the son of Rahab, and eventually he marries Ruth. And it's kind of important that Ruth marries into this family because this is eventually going to continue the line that's going to be important to get to Jesus. So he was a super cool guy. He saw Ruth working in the fields and kind of just remember Ruth's husband died and someone had to take care of her. And so he kind of left some extra grain for her to pick up and kept an eye on her and eventually would marry her that way. He would take her in after all the stuff that goes on in the book of Ruth. But, he's a pretty interesting character to read about. So go take a look at that. So you have Peter, Rock, versus Boaz, the cool guy who married Ruth. So, yeah, kind of take a look at that one. Jonah versus Rebecca. All right, so we got two more left. And this one, I'm trying to sway your vote in the slightest, but I'm just not a fan of the next character that's coming up just because of the story and how it ends with them. But we have Jonah coming in at the 7th seed. Okay, so with Jonah coming in, we know Jonah and the whale. You can read up on that. And, I kind of read too much into it because I like to see what happens at the end of the story, how he doesn't change as a person. But he does eventually, he will do what God asks him to do. And he will go and tell the people, stop doing what you're doing. God's going to come destroy the city. None of us like, oh no, we shouldn't do that. And then boom, everything works out for everybody except for Jonah, who's sitting in the hot sun and just not having a good time by the end of it. But like I said, don't try to sway your vote. There's some good things going on there in the book of Jonah. You can take a look at it. Short book, good for you to read if you haven't read it before. But Jonah's up against Rebecca. Now Rebecca's another tough one. Okay, if you remember, Rebecca is the mother of Jacob and Esau. We already talked about Jacob and Esau. It's funny that the 3 family members are all in this group are all in the same bracket. But you have to decide: what was Rebecca doing? Why was she trying to give Jacob all the stuff that he needed and kind of taking it from Esau? And depending on how deep you dig into it, as a mother, she was told that the younger one would rule over and then rule over the rest of them. So maybe she's trying to make sure that prophecy comes true. Jacob was more of an educated one and worked inside and was kind of a mama's boy if you look at it, whereas Esau was a daddy's boy and hunted and gathered and did all that stuff. Was a burly man. So depending on what you want to say about that one, you go and you think about it. But there's those two. Decide which one you want to go in. Right now, just so you know, they have Rebecca at 78% at winning that shot at winning. So that's kind of a sway the other direction. Might be the first upset, but you decide who you want to go in there. Luke versus Priscilla. All right. And last, here we go. You have, coming in at the number 2 seed, you have Luke versus Priscilla at 15. So real quick, Luke, obviously you can find him, read about him through some of the Gospels and what he's written, what he's known for. He's in the book of Acts, or he's known for writing the book of Acts, which is the history book of the church, which is super important to the church if you think about it. You got to know the history where it is, and he documented a lot of it, or is credited for documenting a lot of it. Obviously, he was a disciple, and he was a physician. That's got to be worth something, right? But I think the biggest thing he's known for is writing the history of the church. So, kind of do your research on it and see how you think that stacks up with Priscilla. Now, Priscilla is one of the is a very interesting women characters that comes up in the Bible, and she's one of the early missionaries from the book of Romans. So go look that up if you want to, and realize that she worked with Paul, and she was one of the people that kind of helped Paul go do all the things he needed to do. She's even credited, possibly, what some scholars don't go with, possibly helping write one of the books. I think one of the things that took away from Priscilla was she's always mentioned with her husband in the Bible, and a lot of people then obviously didn't have quite as much respect for women on preaching, but she's one of the ones that did it anyways. Even though her husband was there, she's one of the ones who still went through doing the missionary work. So she's one of the important female characters. Now, granted, she's up against Luke, the author of the history book of the church. So that's a tough one to have to get through, but she's in there. So those are the matchups that you see right there. I hope you take time to read up on these characters, and I will let you know on Wednesday who made it to the next round. And it should be exciting. I'm interested to see what everyone votes for in this. Take the time to look up all these characters. Take the challenge to look up on some of these characters. Get familiar with the characters you're not quite knowledgeable about, and then by the end of the month you're going to know 64 Bible characters. So when you hear their name mentioned in Sunday school, or Andy mentions from the pulpit, you know what we're talking about. And I'll guarantee you there's some of them to listen to these first 16 that we talked about that you don't even know. It's going to be good for you. So take the challenge, see what you think about them, go through, vote. I'll let you know who wins the next one. And like I said, there's 64 characters. We'll go through 16 on Wednesday, 16 next Sunday, and then 16 the next Wednesday. That's the first round. Then eventually we'll start knocking it down to see who's going to get into Sweet 16, Final Four. And for those of you that are sports fans, this is a good chance for you to be able to kind of have some kind of something to cheer for the whole time. Pick your favorites, see where it goes. I'm not going to mention who's in the other brackets yet till we get there. Kind of keep it a surprise. You can see where they're ended up in the seed. And, hopefully your favorite will win. So until next time, read up on these characters, and I'll let you know who wins. Have a good one.